On today's episode of media that reads completely different to me now that I am no longer a sheltered high schooler, oh my gosh, is The Yellow Wallpaper a deeply unsettling story. And then the history of it, which I didn't know until now, makes it so much worse. Anyway, what was the other thing? I saw something recently that I studied in high school, and then I was like, wow, this feels different now that I'm a grown-up who understands the world. Oh, Doubt. I went to see Doubt, A Parable on Broadway, which is fantastic. Liev Schreiber and Amy Ryan. Oh, so good. But with the context of being a human who's existed in the world, knows how the world... Wow. So much. Anyway, take the time to revisit things that you studied in high school as an adult. It's a wild every single time. I highly, highly recommend it. Also, I was gonna wear yellow for this video and then I forgot, and I'm too lazy to put on different clothes because I like this outfit and it's giving me gender. So this is what we're gonna go with. Video description. I'm wearing a very light green, almost white tank top and black overalls, and I have short curly hair, and I'm also a white person. And oh, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has leaves on it that are green. I'm so sorry. I don't know what just happened to my brain. Let's talk about The Yellow Wallpaper. The plan was to talk about the mechanisms of madness and disability in the story because that's my thing, but then I discovered way more history behind it that it also definitely needs to be addressed because the social justice, all social justice is connected, and oh boy did Charlotte Perkins Gilman have some skeletons in the closet, as it were, while she herself happened to be out of the closet. Also didn't know that. Anyway, The Yellow Wallpaper is a short story published in January of 1892 that tells the story of a woman who is suffering from some form of likely postpartum depression, considered nervous depression with a slight hysterical tendency at the time, and her husband, a physician, prescribes her the rest cure as the treatment, taking her to a house far away and leaving her in the attic nursery with the yellow wallpaper. During her stay there, she is forbidden to do work of any kind. This is part of the rest cure, which we're going to talk about shortly. And the story itself is her writings as she secretly keeps a sort of diary that she hides from her husband. He's super gaslighting and infantilizing and weird, and she talks about hiding how she feels from him, and it's just deeply unsettling. The first time around, I did not pick up on the psychological warfare undertones, but I certainly did this time around. And over time, with the sheer lack of things to do, she starts to become obsessed with this yellow wallpaper, then begins to believe that there is a woman trapped in the wallpaper who's trying to get out, begins to sleep all day and stay awake all night to be able to catch glimpses of this wallpaper woman, and then at the end she ends up locking herself in the room, tearing down the wallpaper to free the woman, and it becomes somewhat unclear whether the narrator herself is the woman trapped behind the wallpaper or not, and they like merge. Whatever, that's the end of the story. Woo! It's about a 30-minute read. I'll link it at the top of the description for you. You should definitely check it out. It feels haunted, which is really unique and cool. It's a very important piece of literature and of history. And it also didn't really gain popularity until the feminist press reprinted it in 1973 and then kind of blew up as a preliminary feminist text, which is likely the reason that you read it somewhere during high school English. Now, looking at the narrator's symptom profile in this text, the major thing most scholars point out are the fact that she is continuously exhausted and lethargic, pointing to some element of depression, and the fact that she has hallucinations. I've seen interpretations of this as major depressive illness, postpartum depression, and postpartum psychosis, schizoaffective disorder, depressive type, bipolar 1, and or arsenic poisoning, because wallpapers in the era had arsenic in them, and arsenic poisoning can cause nervous system issues and hallucinations, and she does mention that the wallpaper smells very odd, so there is something weird and concerning about it. I think it's important to note that it is implied that some semblance of her mental illness was noted when she was at her home after the baby was born, and then she was brought to this place with the yellow wallpaper, so at least some semblance of these things were not caused by the environment, or at least the environment that is the room with the yellow wallpaper. She was mentally ill before she ended up in this space. In regards to diagnosis at the time, this era is when we see a very strong focus on neurasthenia and hysteria, which are technically different things, but nobody can quite argue what their precise differences are, so we're gonna lump them together just like they did. Hysteria as a diagnosis was very common, though it was exclusively for wealthy white women. Pharmaceutical companies saw the popularity of this diagnosis and started to deliberately market towards it and made it even more common therefore, and many women were self-diagnosing. Normally in older texts we see references to self-diagnosis as being inherently bad and an issue limited to hypochondriacs rather than the nuanced conversations that we have today. But in this case, you actually get to see her self-diagnosis as almost a form of liberation for her, as her husband continues to tell her she's getting better, and she keeps trying to explain that she's fairly sure that she's getting worse. It feels almost like that acknowledgement of what I've been diagnosed with is wrong. I feel like it must be something else, but my husband's controlling me, so what am I going to do about it? The self-diagnosis of it all is a clear line of autonomy for her throughout the text. Like, she knows how she's feeling better than her husband does, but he refuses to listen to her, and so she holds that knowledge that she knows what she's talking about as a piece of identity for herself, as she otherwise loses many other parts of who she is. The rest cure, which has been described as a common treatment for nervous women, was created by a Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, who was mentioned by name in this story. He was the leading expert on women's mental health in the country at the time. The rest cure has 3 tenets: isolation, rest, and feeding. The patient was instructed to lie in bed for 24 hours each day, sometimes for months at a time, with a special nurse who would sleep on a cot in the room, feed her, and keep her mind from morbid thoughts by reading aloud or discussing soothing topics. Visits from family and friends were forbidden. The day was punctuated by electrotherapy and massage, sponge baths with a rough rub using wet sheets, and frequent feedings. The diet consisted of milk alone for the first week, or if milk was not tolerated, 18 or more raw eggs per day. Mitchell also wrote about how it required some semblance of psychological manipulation in order to ensure a calming childlike innocence in the patient, for them to recover. Mitchell equated a woman's happiness with her appeared docility, assuming that if she stopped wanting things, she would stop desiring things and then would therefore be finally happy. It's just awesome. The thing is, in this story, we in fact see how this so-called cure instead very much worsens her condition, which for the record is pretty much what we know it did to the majority of the people who had the rest cure, probably. I guess the other option was to be shoved into an institution that didn't feed or clothe the person and actively restrain, sedated, and abused them, so I guess this was preferable, but also what? Like, hello? That shouldn't be preferable. Anyway, the most common analysis of this story is the gender one, I think partially because it was made famous after being published by the feminist press, but also because it very clearly touches on the themes of female subjugation and marriage, with the seeming point of it being about how constant boredom and lack of purpose and autonomy is a major cause of mental health issues in women. It also demonstrates how the medical system thinks it knows everything about women's body minds and fails miserably, not just with the general like, wow, this so-called cure is ineffective, but also with how the husband continues to insist that she is improving and getting better while she keeps insisting that she is getting worse. And because of how he is framed in the story, we can see how manipulative he is, so we do trust our narrator even as we watch her descent into madness. Particularly with how much he refers to as like his little goose, and he repeatedly says how much he loves her while she repeatedly talks about how she's like hiding her journal from him, how she has to hide her emotions from him, how she doesn't tell him things, and she starts to question throughout the course of the story if he actually loves her at all. Gilman also continues this theme by never directly naming the narrator. There's a mention of a Jane at the end of the text that some have taken to mean that the woman's name is Jane. There's a different interpretation we're going to talk about later that I think I agree with more. But by not giving us this woman's name, it both gives us the ability to feel like we are her, and it also makes us realize that she is defined solely in relation to her husband, further stripping her of identity and autonomy. And that's basically where the average 11th grade English class leaves you when it comes to this text. But let's talk about disability, because all oppression is interconnected and you cannot comment on one without commenting on the other. And specifically with disability, the majority of oppression is rooted in ableism, often more specifically in regards to mental disability, feeble-mindedness to be precise, and in reverse, marginalization and oppression is inherently disabling in the sense that the stress of it can cause actual physical disability, which we know about, but also that not having full unimpeded access to a space because of your minority status is inherently also disability. Womanhood specifically, at least in Western society, is seen as the original disability, and that the first woman was created from a man and is therefore a slightly deformed version of a man in the Bible, which sounds weird when you first hear about it, but then you start thinking about what that implies about the women's medical history, and then you look at what actual women's medical history look like, and you start to go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So there you go. Now you know. Now what's interesting, right, is that we can more or less look at womanhood as disability itself because patriarchy constructs it that way. In seeing women as defective, weak, hysterical, we are viewing them as fundamentally disabled people, whether we would technically medically qualify them as what we now today consider to be disabled or not. I don't know if I explained that in the clearest way possible. Hopefully that made an iota of sense. Now what Wallpaper does really well is it reflects the fluidity of that disability label through the fluidity of her madness. You can see her situation clear as day, and it makes you wonder if she really does have some mental condition, or if she's just responding reasonably to the situation of her surroundings. And it somewhat destabilizes the concept of madness because you're on her side. You understand why she's behaving the way that she is, more or less, and you kind of believe her, more or less, which is such an important statement about disability. In this text, she humanizes the mad and makes you see that we do not care for them properly. We do not give proper resources. We refuse to listen to how they feel or believe what they say, and by locking them up and putting them in isolation and restraining them, we are removing their autonomy and therefore making them sicker. Now we're going to talk about the author's opinions on disability in a bit, but let's just say for now that she did not at all seem to care about the wider implications of disability and institution reform that this piece of literature could have, but a guy can dream. I'm gonna dream. Now, what's interesting about this, though, is that when we read it today, we usually completely divorce it from a discussion of disability. We see her as your average, empowered, able-bodied-minded feminist who has madness thrust upon her and then barely escapes from it, rather than acknowledging that she was ill, was therefore brought to this place, and this place then led to the worsening of her mental disability, and therefore we somewhat end up erasing the disability from the disabled character because we look over it in an attempt to focus on the image of a feminist sister suffragette character in a temporary situation that she can get out of image that we have of this person, which makes sense because that's also how Charlotte Perkins Gilman lived her life. Yes, I am going to be making large comments as to how this short story and the wider context of it clearly demonstrates how we handle activism and the uplifting of oppressed people by stomping on other oppressed people. It's going to be great. Stand by. Okay, so Charlotte Perkins Gilman was born in 1860 in Hartford, Connecticut. She lived in several different places. Doesn't majorly matter. But she did go to RISD, the renowned School of Design, which doesn't matter to most people, but it matters to me. And if you know me personally, you know why. She had a very haphazard education growing up, but she read a great deal. Also, her great aunt was Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in 1884, Charlotte married a guy named Charles Stetson, and a year later gave birth to her only daughter, Catherine. She struggled a great deal with postpartum depression, and so she went west for a while, and she felt a lot better. She felt like she'd healed, and so then she went back to her family in Providence, and then her symptoms returned, and she was feeling very distressed by those symptoms, so she sent a letter to the famed Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, saying, "I am an artist of sufficient merit to earn an easy living when well. I am a reader and thinker. I can do some good work for the world if I live. I cannot bear to die or go insane or linger on in this wretched invalid existence and be a weight on this poor world which has so many now. I want to work to help people to do good. I did for years and can again if I get well." He supposedly didn't even read her letter in full, simply prescribed her the rest cure, which involved forbidding her to write, and she did the rest cure, was beyond miserable, did not do very well, with her later saying it brought her so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that she could see over. This is where things get wild. So in 1888, Charlotte leaves Stetson. She's done. Off she goes to California with her daughter. A few years later, while still legally married to Stetson, she meets a woman by the name of Adeline Knapp. And Knapp? I don't know. They move in together. They live together for 2 years before breaking up and moving apart. Adeline's life, also wild. She wrote the majority of anti-suffragette propaganda. She also looked like a butch lesbian. She was also in the Philippines for a while. Read a Wikipedia page. It's a good time. You'll soon figure out why she and Charlotte maybe were not the best match for each other, or rather a match made in hell, maybe? I don't know. Either way. Anyway, so during this time when she is being gay, she writes the Yellow Wallpaper. She publishes it. She said that she wrote this basically to stop Dr. Mitchell from getting away with torturing people with his rest cure. She sent a copy of it to him and also to her ex-husband, who she was still married to, so it's not technically her ex. And Mitchell did end up modifying his methods after this happened, so she was effective in her only goal for the text. She then divorced Stetson, finally, took 6 years of being separated from him, and then 6 years after that she married her cousin, Houghton Gilman, and supposedly they lived happily ever after, and they were together until her death in 1935. Charlotte spent most of her time writing about challenging gender roles. She campaigned for women's economic liberation, and she also traveled the US and Europe to give lectures on women's issues, labor issues, and social reform, though she explicitly refused to be called a feminist and thought that was an insult. She also founded a magazine called The Forerunner that was primarily for her political writings. That does not mean, however, though she was politically active and against gender roles, that what she was doing was a great thing. When Gilman is described as a social reformer and activist, part of this was advocating for compulsory militaristic labor camps for Black Americans, a suggestion on the Negro Problem, 1908. Part of this is pleading for racial purity and stricter border policies, as in the sequel to Herland, or for sterilization and even death for the genetically inferior, as in her other serialized Forerunner novel, Moving to the Mountain. Yay! Now, unlike how we perceive the narrator of The Wallpaper, Gilman did not have one weird bout with mental illness caused by a terrible medical treatment. She struggled with it for her entire life, as did many of the women in her family. Yet Gilman was unsatisfied with her achievements and estimated that she had lost 27 years of productivity due to her nervous malady, which she described as a constant dragging weariness miles below zero, absolute incapacity, absolute misery. To the spirit, it is as if one were an armless, legless, eyeless, voiceless cripple. Employing popular eugenic terminology, Gilman described herself as weak, dark, and feeble-minded, limited of all usefulness. But at the same time, since she was able to pass as what she called normal, and when she tried to talk about her mental health struggles with her peers, they denied that it was real and laughed at her, she did not consider herself to be a real defective, and spent all of her time and energy pushing for legislation to sterilize disabled people to, quote, reduce the number of the wholly unfit. Much of the legislation she was pushing for would have also very much applied to her, not just in like a, oh, they're mentally ill and I'm mentally ill kind of way, but in the sense that there was one specific law that was automatically against their will sterilizing people who had hereditary familial cases of mental illness, which she would have classified for because almost all of her family struggled with postpartum depression. So that's cool. But at the same time, she did also think that she was a terrible mother and did not have any more children, and so maybe she did wish that she was a part of that legislation. I don't know. I don't think so though, because it seems like she was either fully unaware that she counted, or she was trying to pretend that she did not count through sheer force of will. She wrote about her mental disability in a way that gives off the same energy of like, yeah, I struggle with my diagnosed disability every day, but that doesn't mean it's a part of how I live my life at all, and I'm not disabled. Do not dare lump me in with the other people who are like that, which can very much be worked on, like, in community. And given that she genuinely did try to talk about it and was laughed at, it seems like she could have used that community. She seemed to understand that disability as a category was not her fault, but then in the way that, like, the madness is not the fault of the woman in the yellow wallpaper. But then at the same time, she also blamed herself for not resisting the social pressures that got her into the situation in the first place. And then once she got out of that situation, she started like being angry at herself for not overcoming the situation. And it's so sad because like I used to see myself that way. It was really, really hard to live that way. So I do feel for her, but also because the yellow wallpaper literally proves how enforced confinement and circumscribed intellectual and physical activity contribute to poor health, exacerbating rather than mitigating impairment. And imagine if she had spent her time writing anti-institutionalization propaganda instead of the racist stuff that we're about to talk about and the other eugenicist stuff. Like, imagine the positive impact that she could have had with her activism. And what I find interesting is that specifically in this context, not just for her as an author, but also for us as readers, we tend to look at the narrator's experience as an allegory for other things that we all experience as a result of patriarchy on a daily basis. And like, this is an extreme case, a one-off thing that doesn't really happen much, and her insanity is different from other kinds of insanity. We get it, we know who she is deep down, and she's gonna get back to who she is deep down once she's in a better place. She's not like all those other crazy people. But what if this isn't an extreme case, right? And this is what it looks like for all other disabled people as well, because it does. Like, this story does a fantastic job of humanizing mental disability, but then also seems to say, yeah, but just in this case, don't generalize this to anybody or anything anywhere else. It's fine. It's just a one-off situation. And I'm not sure that's something that's implied in the text or just how we consume media around disability more in general, but it is both fascinating and also infuriating to me. Also, race stuff. That's what we're talking about. Great. As I said earlier, Harriet Beecher Stowe was her great aunt. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is an anti-slavery novel known primarily for showing the horrors of American slavery and sort of assumed being a huge part of the beginning of the Civil War. But it also had a ton of racial stereotypes implied to be innate characteristics of all African Americans and very much supported colonization and the intellectual superiority of white people. So, you know, also, before you start going in the comments being like, well, we can't blame them for thinking that. They were products of their time. Not everybody thought this way. These people had free will. Yes, some of it is a product of their time, but also not all of it. And let us not excuse eugenicists and racist behavior just because of the year that it took place in. If we can have a trans clinic in Berlin in the 1920s focusing on the science of homosexuality as natural human variance, we can have people who do not believe in racist caricatures and eugenics in the 1850s. If you go to my history of eugenics video, which I will link up here, there were a significant amount of people in this era who believed eugenics to be pseudoscience. Anyway, Gilman very much took after her aunt. She was also a nativist, which is equivalent to being a nationalist, basically meaning that she was anti-immigration. She believed that her American birthright made her superior to everybody else. She wrote a significant amount of anti-immigration texts. We can also see how she felt about immigrants via her letters as well. I'm not going to read quotes from them. They're bad. The particular race that bothered her the most was what was at the time called the yellow race. Yes, this is going in the direction you think that it is going. At the time, people believed in three races, black, white, and yellow. Yellow would consist of Asian folks, light-skinned African Americans, and the Jewish, Polish, Hungarians, Italians, and Irish. So when it comes to yellow wallpaper, in which we see distorted images with their lolling necks and bulbous eyes staring everywhere with their peculiar odor and yellow smell, their colors repellent, almost revolting, smoldering and unclean, sickly and particularly irritating, their new shades of yellow erupting constantly, that she thinks that they should just whitewash and get rid of it because it's such a problem. Suddenly the yellowness of the wallpaper contains multitudes, doesn't it? Almost like the curtains aren't always just blue. Lancer argues that the influx of Asian immigrants into California at the end of the 19th century, where Gilman was living when she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, had caused mass anxiety about yellow peril, and that widespread racism practiced by well-educated white Americans managed to achieve a degree of intellectual respectability. Against that backdrop, Lancer insists that new readings of the story became possible, since the color yellow a century ago connoted such negative traits as inferiority, strangeness, cowardice, ugliness, and backwardness. And the fact that it's the wallpaper specifically that disgusts her, and not more specifically anything else in the space, further implies the imagery of it being skin. and this choice being very deliberate. The narrator also implies that the yellow of the wallpaper stains everything it touches, and in great depth discusses the house that she is in as being a classic, old-fashioned ancestral house with a garden and a private wharf. What's also interesting that was spoken about in Susan Lancer's article, Feminist Criticism, the Yellow Wallpaper and the Politics of Color in America. Also, teachers, if you want to add this part of the story to your curriculum now, this is the paper you're going to want to make them read. In regards to disability, there's a Disability Studies Quarterly article linked to my sources I would also recommend. Those would be my major two to add to your curriculum. You're welcome. Also, you can read Weir Mitchell's stuff about the Rest Cure. I mentioned that below as well. I'll put my favorite 3 sources at the top so you can, and I'll separate them so it's clear which ones you should add to your classroom. Anyway, the thing Lancer spoke about is the clear references between Jane Eyre when describing the house and the room. And in Jane Eyre, there is what Lancer describes as a dark Creole woman who might well have been called Yellow in Gilman's America, named Bertha, who is locked in the 3rd floor of Thornfield, and she is mad. Now, the amount of seeming references to Jane Eyre implies that perhaps the narrator perceives the woman behind the wallpaper to be Bertha herself. One of the final lines being, "I've got out at last in spite of you and Jane," may directly refer to that text, and therefore is the narrator projecting her inner madness, often perceived as savagery, onto this yellow woman that she simultaneously wants to free but also fears what might happen if she does free that woman? Or are we looking too much into this and it's not that at all? I don't know, but let's be real with ourselves. Her specialty was writing propaganda, and most of it was focused around demonizing racialized people, particularly those who would be categorized as yellow, and her descriptions of them in her other works are almost identical to how she describes this wallpaper, so I really don't think this is a weird coincidence. This feels really, really deliberate. But tying all this back into where I think most of us first met this story, we see it as a core part of feminist history, along with the likes of like Susan Glaspell's Trifles and Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. And we don't usually look at it beyond the feminist lens. We're just kind of like, oh yeah, she wrote this thing, she worked as an activist, and we don't actually look at what she was an activist for and whether maybe that was a good thing or not. But like once you start looking at it from all sorts of directions and see how the life of an author might have affected their work, the same text suddenly starts to tell a completely different story, and I would argue a more interesting one, objectively. I feel like as a piece of curriculum, this has gone from here's how to write about patriarchy and use metaphor to here's how to think critically about authorial intent and examine works intersectionally. Just because it's progressive for one group does not mean that it is for any of the others. And I also think that it's such a great example of the nature of activism, in how this author deliberately separated herself from any other social movement in order to promote women's rights. And I think we're very used to the conversations of, oh, second wave feminism was a really racist time. But in this case, we see a disabled woman, objectively, actively grapple with the cognitive dissonance of her lived experience and internalized ableism, and choose to discriminate against her peers because actually, she's not like those people. She's different. She's normal. And we, in my apartment, have a homemade magnet on the fridge that says being in a minority does not absolve you from sucking. And I think that sentiment really applies here, because just because you are in an oppressed group does not mean you can't still cause harm for that oppressed group. And in her case, she worked to prove that women weren't crazy people, and instead insanity was created by lack of purpose, and so they therefore deserved the right to work and find purpose, which may help that one group in the short run, but we're not free until we're all free, so stepping on others to push yourself forward ends up doing more harm than good. I'm not sure how I ended up on this soapbox, but here we are. Final point to wrap it up. Critical thinking through media analysis from all angles is really cool, and we should definitely do it more. I hope that you learned something today. This is all I have. I sure as heck did. I kept researching simple questions, and then more things kept coming up, and I was like, oh my gosh, oh no, and then more things would come up, and I'd be like, oh dear, and then it just... Anyway, let me know your interpretations of the this notoriously ambiguous, confusing text, what you love about it, what you hate about it, which year of high school you were forced to read it in, all that fun stuff in the comments. Just please be mindful about how you use words such as crazy and insane and mad. Thank you. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it is never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.